Masechet Yoma Daftet, a fantastic and famous Agadot today about the destruction of the Shiloh, first Bet HaMikdash, second Bet HaMikdash. This is the source. This is the source we all quote on Tisha B'Av. We're starting with the Parhedrin. We mentioned that the place where the Kohen Gadol sleeps for those 7 nights is called Lishkat Parhedrin, and that was a derogatory name because the Kohanim Gadolim, they changed over so often because they were bribing their way to become Kohen Gadol, and each one would bribe the next one, the one from the one before, and they only lasted an average of a year each. And so, since we're talking about the unfortunate corruption of the Kohanim, that's going to be the theme today. So, we're going to start off with a little bit of halacha. And this is a Mishnah, which we're going to talk about the Parhedrin again, and with regard to this Mishnah. That's why we're bringing it. It's a Mishnah Masechet Demai. Demai means produce that we bought from an Amaretz. We're not sure. Did he take to the Mot Masrot or not? What's the law? So this Mishnah is specifically about a baker. Tenan hatam hanach tomin lo chayevu otan chachamim lafrish ella terumat maaser vehala. So a baker, he buys his grain from an amaretz, and now he's making loaves and he's going to sell them. What is his responsibility? So it says the chachamim, they said they has to bring terumat maaser and chala. Now chala, of course, because there's no way someone could bring challah beforehand because it wasn't dough yet. It only becomes chayav when it becomes dough. So for sure, he's going to have to bring challah. But in terms of terumot masrot, only terumat maaser. That means the 10th of a tenth, right? I give a tenth to the Levi. Levi has to give a tenth to the Kohen. So this guy, even though he's not actually giving the tenth to the Levi, he has to take that 1% and give it to the Kohen. That's it. That's all he has to do, nothing else. Okay, that's the Mishnah. We're going to analyze it. Why not? What about all the other items? Bishlama teruma gedola lo detanya לפי ששלח בכל גיבולי ישראל וראה שאין מפרישין אלא תרומה גדולה בלבד. So he doesn't have to bring תרומה גדולה because one time there was a Kohen Gadol named Yohanan Kohen Gadol, not sure really who this is, but anyway, he did a survey and he said, what do people, Amei Haaretz, what do they typically do? They do separate teruma gedola. That's the first thing you have to separate. It's an average of 2%. It could be any amount. And that's very strict. So even Amei Haaretz, they don't want to be chayav mitabi de shamayim, so they take teruma gedola. So therefore, he can assume that the produce he bought, the farmer already took that. So that's no problem. Maaser rishon, maaser ani, namelo hamosim havero alav hadeayam. And now, since we're not sure, did the farmer Amaretz, did he take maaser rishon? That goes to a Levi. Maaser ani on the 3rd and 6th years, that go to a poor person. Maybe he took them, maybe he didn't. So the baker, he does have to separate them, right? He does have to say, okay, this 10th. Well, I'm separating from Maaser Rishon, but he doesn't have to give it to a Levi, because if a Levi wants it, so we have a principle. If you're taking something from someone else, then you have to bring the proof. Since the baker is in possession of it, let a Levi come, prove, here I am a Levi, prove that the farmer beforehand did not take maaser. If he can bring all the proofs, come to court, then I'll give it to him. Otherwise, I'm going to keep it. And so, therefore, and the same thing with an ani, let the ani come and prove that it was not taken before. This is actually a very useful halacha l'maaseh today. If you live in Israel and you get some produce, like you have a tree in your backyard and you get some bananas or oranges, anything, and you have to take to the maaser, do you have to actually give a tenth to the Levi? Well, you could. There's nothing wrong with it, but you don't have to, because let the Levi come and prove that he's really a Levi, right? And especially if it's demai, if you buy it in the shuk and there's no hechsher in Israel. So maybe it was taken before, maybe not. Therefore, you can keep both the maaser rishon and maaser ani. Of course, you can give it to the ani. That's and if it's your own, if it's tebel that you got from your backyard, certainly then you should give it to the ani. But this is an important principle that's used today to make it easier for people who live in Israel to fulfill Terumot and Masrot. Really, you'd only have to throw out 1%. That would be Terumat Masrot plus a little for Terumah. Okay, so we figure out all those. Ela maaser sheni nifreshu v'nisku v'nechluhu b'Yerushalayim. On the first, second, fourth, and fifth years of Shemitah, then he has to give maaser sheni, which means he separates it, and he takes it to Jerusalem and eats it himself. So the baker, why shouldn't he do that, right? It's going to himself. It has to be eaten in Jerusalem, so you can't apply Mosima Chavero. Did the farmer do it before? Probably not. So let him do it and eat it in Jerusalem. Okay, that's a good question. Why didn't the Mishnah mention that? Amar Ola mitoch she parhedrin. Here we go. That's why we brought in this whole thing, because we're talking about these parhedrin. These are some government appointees. These would be like low-level officials that were in charge of market prices or tax collecting. And remember, we said that the lishkat, this chamber, is called lishkat parhedrin because there will be a lot of turnover in these government appointees. Every year, someone new would be appointed. And so they're saying the Kohen Gadol became like the parhedrin. Okay, but these are what now we're talking about the actual parhedrin, these government appointees. Halalu chobtinotan kol shenem asar chodesh. Omrin lahen michru bezol, michru bezol. So these people, these government officials who are in charge of the market, they would set a low market price for bread, and they would go and hit the bakers. I hope not literally, but they would apply a lot of pressure on the bakers every 12 months, maybe every time they got their job, to say, sell it cheaply, sell it cheaply. And so therefore the rabbi saw that the bakers are under so much pressure, and since since it's only the Rabbanan, therefore the rabbi said, you know what? Bakers, you don't have to bring Ma'aser Sheni. We see that you're under tremendous pressure, and so we don't want to put that obligation upon you. All right, so that's how we got into this. Now, my parhedrin, purseh, what does the word parhedrin actually mean? Purseh, which means appointees. All right, that's the halacha section. And now we get to the Agada. Amar Abba bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. May dichtib, Yirat Adonai tosif yamim, ushnot resha'im tichsornam. Fear of God will prolong one's days, but the days of evil people are shortened. This is a nice parallelism that the fear of God, this is active and it adds many days, and the years of the Rishaim, they become almost passive, that just happens to him, is not even worthy of having an active punishment against him. Okay, anyway, what's this contrast between many years and few years? Yirat Adonai tosif yamim ze mikdash rishon, sha'amad 410 shanim, velo shimmeshu bo ela 18 kohanim gedolim. The first Bet HaMikdash stood for 410 years. It's about right. It was destroyed in 586, so going back, right? So it was built sometime in the 10th century. That's when Shlomo HaMelech reigned. So we don't have an exact date for when it was built. So this is a tradition that was 410 years. How many Kohanim Gedolim? You can go and count in the Divrei Yamim. It lists a lot. It lists them. We're not sure if the list in Divrei Yamim I brought for you here. This is Wikipedia. Actually, comes from the Jewish Encyclopedia. So it's a very good article, and it has a list of the various Kohanim that are listed in Divrei Yamim, as well as in Josephus and in Midrash called Sedet Olam Zuta. And you can count here about 18. I mean, there might be some actually missing, so you could count 23, but 18 is about correct, or about 20 years for each. So that makes sense. So you see that they had a long life because they were righteous Kohanim Gedolim. ושנות רשעים תקצורנה זה מקדש שני שעמד 420 שנה ושימשו בו יותר מ300 כהנים. The second Bet HaMikdash, however, the vast majority, not all, but the majority of the Kohanim were evildoers, were corrupt, or bribing their way to become Kohen Gadol. And so therefore the second Bet HaMikdash, according to this Midrash, was up for 420 years. This is not an accurate number, right? I mean, we know that the Bet HaMikdash was built in 516, 70 years after the first, and it was destroyed in 70. So add that together, you get 586 rather than 420. That's a discrepancy of 166 years. How do we know our dates? Our dates are really proven by many, many sources. Nebuchadnezzar, we have his writings. We have proof from astrological diaries that people took, and we can reconstruct what the sky looked like. So we know exactly when Nebuchadnezzar was. We know when Cyrus the Great reigned. And so all these are proven. The Midrash is missing 160 or so years from the Persian period. So that's why it conflates 586 years into 420. This has a whole has a lot of ramifications. Even in counting our Hebrew years, right now the traditional count is 5781. If you add in these 166 years, you get to 5947, which means actually we're almost less than 60 years away from the year 6000. So, all right, well, I guess we'll see who's right. In any case, not to get into this very, very difficult and complex subject too much, according to this, the Bet HaMikdash second was up for 420 years, and there were over 300 Kohanim Gedolim. Now, if we try to figure out how long each one reigned, you have to take away the good Kohanim who reigned for a long time. Semehen arba'im shana shishimesh Shimon HaSadik. Shimon HaSadik was a righteous person. Kohen Gadol, he reigned for 40 years. Shimonim shishimesh Yochanan Kohen Gadol. 80 that Yochanan Kohen Gadol. Yochanan was one of the names of the Chashmonaim, who was Kohen Gadol, but he didn't reign for 80 years. But okay, so whoever this is, Ishmael ben Pavi. This Ishmael had 10 years. And Ve'amri la achat esrei shishimesh Rabbi Elazar ben Harsum. Some add also 11 years of this Rabbi Elazar. Mekan ve'elach seva chashov kol echad ve'echad lo hosi shenato. So if you add up all these good Kohanim who reigned for a long time, you have to take out about 130 or 141 years, and you get even out of the four, and you get even less than 300, which means all the remaining Kohanim Gedolim, the other 295 Kohanim, each reigned for less than a year on average. Okay, do we have a list of these 300? Not quite. If we look at a major source for this is actually Josephus, mentions the Kohanim going way back. And so we have somewhat of a list, a pretty long list of people. If you look at them, it adds up to a few dozen, less than 100. So I think the 300 here is an exaggeration, but it is the point is well taken, because if you see, many of the Kohanim reigned for only less than a year or only 1 year, or right, just about that. So this turnover rate does point to a lot of instability and corruption. Okay, so the point is correct. All right, so that's the application of the pasuk, that when one is righteous, they live a long time. Evildoers end up having a short reign. Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta. Okay, now since we're talking about corrupt Kohanim, so we lead into the events of Shiloh. Why was Shiloh destroyed? It had two sins. One is illicit sexual relations and degrading the sacrifices. Gilui arayot tichtiv ve'ali zaken me'od ve'shama et kol asher ya'asun banav lechol Yisrael ve'et asher yishkebun et hanashim hasobeot petach ohel mo'ed. So there you go. It's explicit in Sefer Shemuel that the sons of Ali would take advantage and abuse the women who would come to the Bet HaMikdash. To the Mishkan. So that seems, they are abusing their position of power. So that's pretty explicit. Now it's true. We did see this. We saw this back in Masechet Shabbat. That one opinion of the name of Rabbi Yochanan says anyone who says the children of Eli sinned is mistaken. They did not sin. And so, what the pasuk says that they were abusing the woman. What does that mean? No, it doesn't mean literally. It's just that these women, they were bringing their bird sacrifices because they became tameh, maybe they were zava or yoledet, and they needed the kohen to sacrifice it so that they could become tahor and go back to their husbands. The sons of Ali were lazy; they didn't do it on time. They weren't careful to do it, so the woman had to stay an extra day or two to make sure that their sacrifice is really going up. And because they had to stay, they couldn't go back to their husbands. So it's not that they were actually physically abused. but rather because the sons of Eli caused them to not be with their husbands, it's as if. All right. Anyway, even according to this, still, nevertheless, the pasuk says it's as bad as if they actually slept with them, and so therefore this is still called a sin of gilui adayot, whether it was direct or less severe. Either way. Bizyon kadashim dichtiv gam beterim yaktirun tachele boba na'ar hakohen v'amar la'ish hazobech tena basar lislot lakohen v'lo yikach memecha basar mevushal ki im Hi. This is just a long quote. They don't have to give a drasha of the Pesukim, that before the chelib is the part of the animal that's supposed to be put on the mizbeach, sumitza shelamim, and then the kohen takes his section that he's allowed to take, the thigh and the breast, and then the rest of it the owners will bring. But what did Bnei Ali do? Even before they offered the correct part on the mizbeach, they would have the officiant there go and tell the guy, give us money, give us meat right now, so we're going to go and barbecue it. And we don't want yours after you cook it. We want to take it now, ki im chai. And the person bringing the korban would say, please, just offer it correctly first on the mizbech, the parts that are supposed to be offered, and then take whatever you want. Where we're willing to share. They weren't being stingy. And the Kohanim would say, no, we want to give it to us right now. If not, we're going to take it forcibly. You see just how greedy and evil they were, and besides both Ben Adam Lachavero and the way that they treated Kodashim, the sacrificial animals, and therefore because of these two sins, Shiloh was destroyed. All right, I mean that's in fact true, right? Then the Adon was taken right then, and Ali died. Okay, Mikdash Rishon mipnei ma harav. How about the first Bet Mikdash? Why was it destroyed? Mipnei shlosha devarim shayu bo avodah zara v'gilui adayot ushfichut damim, idolatry, and illicit sexual relations, and murder. Avodah zarah dichtib ki kasar hamasa mehistareya. They're quoting a pasuk in Yeshaya. Interesting. There's like you bring 1,000 pasukim explicit. They did avodah zarah, this, that, but we're bringing one that we have to actually make a derasha on. What does this mean? The bed is too small for stretching. Sometimes if you have to sleep in a bed that's a little narrow, and you keep fighting over and pushing your wife over to the side. So that's what the pasuk is describing, and the cover is too narrow for gathering and keep fighting over it. What is this referring to? What is Yeshaya referring to? Mai kasar hamasa mehistareya, Rabbi Yochanan kasar masa ze mehistared alav shene re'im ke'achad. They says the psalm at the Bet HaMikdash is too narrow for to worship two gods in it, right? And so in the first Bet HaMikdash under King Menashe, others, it's not that they were only doing idolatry. In some way, that would even be better if he just did idolatry. It's even worse that they were syncretistic, that they worshipped Hashem and the idols right there side by side. So this is like a narrow bed. We can't both fit here. You got to pick one, right? Ad matai atem posichim al shnei ha'siripim. Okay, so I mean, it's like it's bad if your wife leaves you and marries another guy. It's worse if she's with two people at once. Amasecha Sarah kehitkanes, and the rest of the pasuk says, and the cover is too narrow. They're fighting over the cover. Amar Rabbi Shemuel bar Nachmani ki mater Rabbi Yochanan lahai kera bache. Rabbi Yochanan got to this pasuk, he would cry. Amar man dichti be kones kaned mehayam. Regarding Hashem, about whom we say in Tehillim that he can take the whole sea and make it into a heap. In other words, the idolatry, people worship the sea and thought it was a divine being, and Hashem showed his control over it during Kinat Yam Suf and took the whole sea and just smashed it into a little heap. And now that has become Sarah. Sarah in the sense, not in the original it's talking about it's too narrow, but Sarah also means a co-wife. And Masecha means the cover, but here they're taking it to mean the idolatry. The idolatry has become a co-wife for Hashem. So how far we have fallen, that Hashem, who showed His glory to Bnei Israel, now Bnei Israel have sinned so badly that they are treating Hashem like a co-wife, that he has as a rival that he can't even control. So I think that the Midrash is quoting this pasuk rather than the explicit idolatry that they're doing, to show not only that they're doing idolatry, but how badly Bnei Israel are in honoring Kadosh Baruch Hu. Gilui arayot tichtiv hayomer Adonai yan ki gabhu benot Zion v'telachna netuyot gadon umsakerot einayim v'haloch v'tafof telachna u'b'raglehen te'akasna. Pasuk from Yeshaya again. And so we're going to analyze, atomize, and explain each section of the pasuk. Pasuk is about why the sin happened to you because the daughters of Zion are haughty, walk with outstretched necks, wanton eyes, walking, mincing as they go, making a twinkling with their feet. Basically, the women are being seductive and so causing gilui arayot. So yan ki gabhu benot Zion shayu mahalechot aruka besad pesara. So it doesn't mean that they were tall. How could you make yourself taller, right? They're growth hormones? No, it's talking about someone who was medium height. She would find two short friends and walk with them. And then the guys will look and say, oh, look how tall she is, right? Because she has two short friends. And they would walk with an outstretched neck, and all being uppity and haughty. That they would wear eyeshadow. Nowadays, most people wear eyeshadow, but back then it was considered prostitutes wore eyeshadow, and so they were being very seductive in that way. And they would walk, strutting themselves. They would take short steps, putting their toe to heel, heel to toe. So that everybody would draw attention to themselves. But look what they would do. We saw this already in Masechet Shabbat, right? That they would put myrrh and persimmon in their shoes. And then they would put them in a little flask. And then when they got to the guys, they would break it with their heel, and then the perfume would spread. And they instilled the evil inclination like venom of a viper to entice the Jewish men. So there you go. That's the Rasha to show that there was Gilui Arayot during the first Bet HaMikdash.
Sold.
Say it again.
I'm sold.
Okay. All right. Are the men not also guilty? Well, they're also guilty, yes, but not. And this pasuk is focusing on the woman's part in the responsibility. Shefichut damim dichtiv v'gam dam naki shafach ben asher be'meod ad asher midle et Yerushalayim pe la pe. And so that's explicit. Menashe did so much murder that there was blood all over from one end of the city to the other. All right, so that's pretty bad. We understand why the first Bet HaMikdash was destroyed. About Mikdash Sheni, she'oskrin b'Torah misvot gmut chasadim ipnei macharev. So how come second Bet HaMikdash, which they were doing Torah, misvot, and kind deeds, so why did it get destroyed? This is historically accurate, right? I mean, we go back, we see that although there were different groups, different sects, but they were very much invested in studying Torah and doing good things. I mean, we see the writings from the Dead Sea Scrolls. You see how dedicated they were. You might disagree with their interpretations, but the people were very dedicated to religion. So, and they weren't idolatrous. We don't have evidence of idolatry in the second Bet HaMikdash. So it seems that it should have been better. So why did they get destroyed? Something that you might think is relatively minor, baseless, hatred. That's why. So the Lamed Chash shekula sinat chinam keneged shalosh avedot avodah zara gilui arayot ushfichut tamim. And that's really the whole point of this midrash, is coming to teach us something that you might think is minor, just baseless hatred, is actually as bad as the big three sins. What baseless hatred is it talking about? Well, there was a lot of rivalry and hatred. Each of the different groups of Jews, the Pharisees, Sadducees, Dead Sea Sect, Essenes, Boethusians, and lots of others. Not only did they disagree in matters of halacha and hashkafa, okay, you can disagree, but they actually killed each other. They formed civil wars. The Romans barely had to do anything. The Jews just killed themselves. So this is all historically very accurate, unfortunately. Sinat chinam, it's an interesting phrase. What does it mean to baseless hatred? Usually when you hate someone, it is for some reason, right? They did something to you. I think it means that sometimes if someone is really so evil that it's worthy of hating them, right? Someone who's really a bad person, you shouldn't be friends with an evildoer. So there is such a thing, but I think most of the time we can someone who's average, is okay person. You can emphasize their good points and say, okay, everybody's flawed, and help them out. And the problem is when you harp on a person's few bad negative traits, or maybe one couple of bad things that they did to you, and then you just hate their entire being. Right, that really is the source of hatred and division, and just breaks up Am Yisrael. And there's no way that we can be successful if we have that. So that's the thrust of the lesson of this Agadah. Okay, now now that we finished that, we're going to say one more thing about the first Bet HaMikdash. Rishayim hayu it's true that they were evildoers and they did murder and rape and idolatry, but they trusted God. So that's worth something. Atan leMikdash Rishon. This statement is talking about the first Bet HaMikdash, not second Bet HaMikdash, even though we just talked about that. Dichtiv. ראשיה בשוחד ישפוטו, וכהניה במחיר יורו, ונביאה בכסף יקסומו, ועל השם ישענו לאמור, הלא השם בקרבנו, לא תבוא עלינו רעה. So, even though the chiefs went for bribes, and the Kohanim were ruling for a fee, and even the Nevi'im were taking money, give me money, I'll tell you a good nevuah, right? And nevertheless, they said, Hashem will take care of us and we won't be destroyed. לפיכך הביא עליהן הקדוש ברוך הוא 3 גזרות כנגד 3 עבירות שבידם שנאמר, לכן בגללכם ציון שדה תחרש, וירושלים עיין תהיה, והר הבית לבמות יער. Because of these 3 sins, so there are 3 levels of punishment, first to Sion, and then to Jerusalem, and then Har HaBayit itself. Each of them will become plowed, become heaps of ruins, will become like overgrown like woods. ובמקדש ראשון, להבה בשנאת חינם. Hold on, you said that the second one's better as the first because the second had שנאת חינם. In the first they had the big 3. But in the first Bet HaMikdash, shouldn't they also have שנאת חינם? והכתיב מגורי אל חרב היו את עמי, לכן ספוק אל ירך. Pasuk in Yechezkel, we should cry and wail for what happened to my people. They'll be cast before the sword together with my people, therefore strike the thigh. So this casting before the sword, you could take literally that an enemy will come and destroy them by sword. But V'amar Rabbi Elazar, אלו בני האדם שאוכלים ושותים זה עם זה ודוקרים זה את זה בחרבות שבלשונם. So it's not literal, but rather it's talking about people who act as if they're friendly and they'll eat and drink together and you have them over for dinner and they make believe that you're friends, but then they stab each other verbally behind their backs. So that's the cherev that's mentioned here, and that's the basis hatred. Yechezkel here is talking about the first Bet HaMikdash. So there you go. There was sinat chinam also in the first Bet HaMikdash. Why'd you count only the big 3? Hahi b'nesiyei Yisrael havai dichtib. So that was actually only talking about the princes, the leaders. The leaders would stab each other in the back and make believe that they're friends. But most people didn't do that in the first Bet HaMikdash time. So that's why we don't count it as one of the big sins of the first Bet HaMikdash. Tichtiv, Ze'ak vehelel ben adam ki hi hayta be'ami. V'tanya, this is the same pasuk as before. V'tanya ze'ak vehelel ben adam yachol lakol. So when it says that cry and wail for what happened to my people, is it that everybody did it? Talmud Omar, he bechol nesi'ei Yisrael. Pasuk says it's referring to the princes of Israel. So since only they were doing it, which is also bad, but it wasn't widespread, so it's not counted as the main reason for the first Bet HaMikdash being destroyed. Rabbi Yochanan v'Rabbi Elazar d'amre tarvayhu. Rishonim shenitgala avonam nitgala kisam. Achronim shelo nitgala avonam lo nitgala kisam. So who's better? According to Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar, the first, meaning the first Bet HaMikdash, because although they did terrible sins, they did their sins in public, which you might think is worse to sin in public. But the point is, even though they sinned, at least they weren't. If you do something in private, then it shows. You steal from someone in private. It means you're not afraid of Hakadosh Baruch Hu. You're only afraid. So it's bad in two ways. You think God's not going to see. Since the first generation, they did their sins in public. So therefore, God exposed the end of their punishment. You'll be punished for 70 years, and that's it. But the people in second Bet HaMikdash, because they would say Lashon Hara, they would stab each other in the back, they would do it a hidden way. And because of that, Hashem did not reveal the end of the exile. Didn't say it's going to be 70 years. We don't know how long it's going to be. Okay, very powerful statement about the Sinat Chinam being really even worse than the big three. And this is a statement that talks about how the generations get worse. Yeridat Hadorot. This is going to be a topic of this next few lines. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Tobasi pornan shel rishonim mikereso shel acharonim. The same Rabbi Yochanan who said that also said that the fingernail of the early generations is better than the entire body of the later generation, right? They had more righteousness in their fingertip, right, than the later generations have. Okay, that's a clear statement of Yeridat Hadorot, that generations get worse and worse. Amar leresh lakish adraba acharonim adifi. That's Rabbi Yochanan's colleague and brother-in-law, says, no, the opposite. The later generations are better because look, even though we have Rome, all the nations that are subduing us, and life is so difficult, look how we learn Torah with such diligence. So, and the early generations, they had independence, they had a king, and they didn't do so good. And we, even through difficult times, are able to study Torah. So actually, our generation is better than theirs. This is very interesting because you find Yeridat Hadorot and lots of different agadot all over the place. It almost became like a dogma. But here, Resh Lakish is saying the opposite, that actually the later generations are better than the earlier ones. There's an article that shows that Rambam also did not accept Yeridat Hadorot. Okay, so that's Resh Lakish. Amar le bira tochiach shechazra lerishonim velo chazra la'acharonim. However, Rabbi Yochanan answers him and say, I don't agree with you, and you can prove it from the bira. Remember, we saw bira as a reference to the Bet HaMikdash. We'll prove it because the first one it came back, it was restored. The second one was not restored. So you see that the first generation, the first Bet HaMikdash, was not so bad. They needed a punishment, but it was temporary, only 70 years. And the second one, I mean, at the time that they're living in the 3rd century, so it's already 150 years, and still the Bet HaMikdash was not rebuilt. And if they're saying that, then imagine everyone studying this Talmud for the past 2,000 years. Sha'alu et Rabbi Elazar, Rishonim gedolim or Acharonim gedolim. So this was an active debate. Who's better, the early generation or the later generation? Amar lehem tinua nechem babira ikadamre. Amar lehem adechem bira. He said, well, look at the Bet HaMikdash. Or another version, the witness is the Bet HaMikdash. So same opinion as Rabbi Yochanan is Rabbi Elazar, right? You see up here, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar were together. They both said. They both made this statement, so there it's them two against Resh Lakish. Resh Lakish hava sacheh beyardena. So now a story: Resh Lakish was swimming in the river, in the Jordan River. Atad Abba Bar Barchana Yahab Le Yeda. Rabba Barchana, he actually quoted him all the way at the beginning of the daf today. So he saw him in the river. He gave him a hand. He reached out a hand. Let me help you up out of the river. Amar le elaha sanena lechu techtib. Okay, so Resh Lakish says, I'm not accepting your help. By God, I hate you Babylonians. All right, this is very interesting. Why does he hate the Babylonians? Is this an example of sinat chinam that we just were talking about? Right? What is the reason why he hates the Babylonians? He's not just talking to Amaharis, he's talking to the Baba Bar Chana, great sage. So let's see why. Tichtiv im chomahi nibnei aleha tirat kasevim deleti nasur aleha luach arez. Okay, so from Shir Hashirim, it's a mashal is talking about their sister. What are we going to do with her? She's reached the age of maturity, but she doesn't look mature. Anyway, it says there, if she's a wall, we'll build silver turret upon her. If she's a door, we'll cover her with boards of cedar. We'll make her beautiful and look nice so that she'll be ready to marry. The nimshal, however, is to Bnei Israel. What is it referring to? You Babylonians, if you had made yourself like a wall, and during the time of Ezra, when the Persians came and said you can go back to Israel and you can rebuild. If you had who came back, a few people came back, some poor people, so a few Leviim, right? But most people stayed and were comfortable back in Bavel. It says if you had come like all en masse, like a wall, then nimshaltem kakesef she'en rakam sholet bo. Then you would have been like silver, which does not rot. In other words, if you all came back and came strong, then the second Bet HaMikdash would never have been destroyed. You would never have gone to exile again. You would have been there strongly. Instead, what did you Babylonians do? You came in drips and drabs, and so therefore it was like a door, right? The door opens, closes, it's halfway open. A few people came in, but you didn't come like a wall. You came like a door, and therefore you're compared to wood, cedar wood. Although cedar wood is known to be strong, but it also can be infested by worms that eat it from the inside. It rots from the inside and doesn't last long. And that's why Resh Lakish says, I hate you Babylonians. Okay, it's a fantastic statement because Resh Lakish is living like 700 years after Ezra, right? So this is a long time to still be blaming the Babylonians for the Jews not coming to Israel 700 years earlier. Maybe he thinks he's still blaming them. You could have come anytime in between. You can even come now. Why are you still living in Bavel? You should come to Israel. If all the Jews had come to Israel, then it would have been that much stronger, that much better off, and the Romans would not have conquered us. So that's why. So it's not personal against Rabbi Bar Chana. He hates all Babylonians. Okay, my Erez Amar Ola Sam Sasmagor. So what is this? What is when it says Erez? Like why particularly Erez? What rots cedar trees? It's a certain worm named Sasmagor. My Sasmagor, and what does that refer to? Amar Bi Abba Bat Kol. It's referring to the Bat Kol. How so? Kedetanya. משמתו נביאים האחרונים, חגי, זכריה, מלאכי, נסתלקה רוח הקודש מישראל, ועדיין היו משתמשים בבת קול. When the last of the Nevi'im died, חגי, זכריה, מלאכי, so ruach HaKodesh, the spirit of holiness, that's the prophetic spirit, left Israel. But even though we don't have full prophecy, we still have a bat kol, the daughter of a voice, like an echo, right? Sometimes in the Bet Midrash, they would hear just an echo, not full prophecy, but a very low-level prophecy. So what does it have to do with the cedar wood? It seems that just like the cedar wood was once strong, but it gets all rotted, and then there's only very little wood left. So that little remnant of wood that's left is similar to the bat kol compared to the full level of nevuah. So that's just explaining what happened before. Now, back to the story. Wait a second. Would Resh Lakish speak to the Rabbi Chana in any case? Forget the fact that he's from Bavel. He doesn't speak to anyone. He didn't like talking to people. Why? Omar Rabbi El-Azar. It's printed Eliezer. It should be Rabbi El-Azar, who's his contemporary, Rabbi El-Azar ben Pedat. The Marad De'arad Yisrael Hava, and he is the greatest sage. He teaches the halacha for Eretz Yisrael. He's the greatest sage of the generation. V'la hava mishta'ai Resh Lakish behadeh, and Resh Lakish will not speak to him even. Lakish spoke to so few people out in the public that if he did talk to someone, you knew that someone was so trustworthy that you can go do a business deal with him without witnesses. Because if Resh Lakish spoke to him, he spoke to almost nobody. So what he's talked to about Hana? Okay, how come Resh Lakish didn't like talking to anybody? It could be, remember his background, but he was once a thief, a gladiator, and so maybe he didn't want to be seen in public talking to people because people will say, remember you, I used to remember we had that fight, he used to be friends with low life people, so therefore he didn't talk to anybody in public, not to have to ignore some people and not to ignore other people and they get insulted. So he spoke to very, very few people, and therefore that's really the reason why he didn't speak about Hana. And maybe it has nothing to do with the fact that he's Babylonian. Amar Rav Papa Shede Gabra Benaihu or Resh Lakish Hava Uzoiri or Bar Hana Hava Rabbi Elazar. Rav Papa says, you're right. You mistold the story. The story is actually, there has to be someone else involved in the story for it to make sense. It could be Resh Lakish and Zairi. Zairi was one of those very few people that Resh Lakish would talk to. He's on the level that he was so trustworthy and all that. So Resh Lakish would talk to him, except that he's from Bavel. So the story makes sense if it's talking about Resh Lakish and Zairi. Or it could be talking about Abba Bar Chana, that he's the one pulling him out, but he wasn't pulling out Resh Lakish, but rather he was pulling out Rabbi Elazar. Okay, so either way, one of these sages was denigrating the Babylonians for not making Aliyah. Ki ata lekamed Rabbi Yochanan amar le, lav hainu ta'ama, so this will end with this. Rabbi Yochanan disagreed with Resh Lakish. Resh Lakish says if all the Jews from Bavel would come to Eretz Yisrael, the Bet HaMikdash would never have been destroyed. Rabbi Yochanan says not true. He says even if all the Jews in the time of Ezra came to Eretz Yisrael, the Shekhinah would not have remained in the second Bet HaMikdash. Why? Tichtib, Yaft Elohim liyefet v'ishkon b'haoleh Shem. This is the blessing that Noah gives to his children, that God gave beauty to Yefet, and he dwells in the tents of Shem. Now, Shem is Semites, that's the Jews. Yefet, he's going to say, are the Persians. Afagav de Yaft Elohim liyefet, en ha-shechina shora ella ba'oleh Shem. Even though God gave beauty to Yefet, the Shekhinah only stays in the tents of Shem. So the tents of Shem, that refers to the first Bet HaMikdash. That was built by Shlomo. That was built by Israelite king. And so God will stay in, if they didn't sin, God would have stayed in the first Bet HaMikdash. But the second Bet HaMikdash was built by the Persians. And so although it was very beautiful, and it was very nice and impressive, nevertheless, because it was built under a foreign power, with the help of foreign money, as beautiful as it is, Hashem was not going to leave his Shekhinah there. And so it has nothing to do with the Jews coming back or not coming back. Even if they did come back, the circumstances of its building were not good. And I wonder if this is maybe a reference or a hint to Herod the Great, who himself was actually not Jewish. And he built this beautiful structure, beautiful Bet HaMikdash, but he was also extremely evil person. And so maybe that's probably what they have in mind. And tomorrow we'll see why they talk about the Persians being from the family of Yefet. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.